Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Tefav. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in memory of my very special mother, Shirley K. Tider, Sarah Rezel Bat Mordechai Yitzchak, and Frida Sima on Judy's birthday. A birthday is a time to make the world a better place, do a cheshbon nefesh, soul searching, give tzedakah, and thank one's mother for what she went through, and so I do with love. Today's daf is sponsored by Batsheva and Daniel Pavan, the second year at Tzedek Batsheva's father, Rav Shlomo ben Yehuda Aryeh Tzifrono Lebracha. My father was an orphan child survivor of Auschwitz who lived to see 3 generations of descendants, including grandchildren and great-grandchildren, serving in Tzahal and Sheirut Leumi. Every morning, my father would get up at 5 a.m. and learn Gemara. He would also complete the entire Sefer Tehillim each week. My dad is and will be forever my hero. This stuff is sponsored by the Schuster family in memory of Dr. Sandra Shimoff, the mother of Randy Schuster. Her devotion to the study of Torah and Shas will always be remembered by her family and all those who knew her. Today's stuff is sponsored by Rabbi Art Gould in gratitude to Hashem on the occasion of his engagement to Lainey Miller Melnick. I never thought I would be this happy again in my lifetime. I stood under the chuppah once and it worked out pretty well. I can't wait to stand under the chuppah again. Mazal Tov. And today's stuff is sponsored by Gary Pershan and for the 17th year at site of her mother, Cyril Bat Moshe Pinchas. Okay, we're going to get started. We have the Mishnah that we started yesterday. As I told you, we keep ending Dapim in the beginning of Mishnayot, not today. We talked about this. The first issue was dependent on a minhag. Number one, we have be'emot akot, small animals. There was a concern of bestiality, and therefore it depended on the custom in the land about whether or not you could sell those animals to Gentiles because of the issue of lifnei iver lo titei machshol, putting a stumbling block. You're putting something in front of someone that's so tempting for them to do that it's a problem. And that's dependent on minhag hamakom. And from there, we went off into the Gemara in terms of saying, wait a minute, but don't we see in a different Mishnah that it's forbidden? You can't put your animal in an inn alone, put the animal in a place where they're alone with the Gentile, and the Gentile will come to engage in bestiality. And that sounds like it's across the board any place, not minhag hamakom. To which Rav answered, no, that Mishnah is just like this Mishnah. Depends on minhag hamakom, and therefore there's no problem. However, Rabbi Elazar, and we're starting with this at the top of our daf, Rabbi Elazar Omer, he distinguishes between the cases. Yichud is forbidden when it comes to the pundak, but we can sell the animal. Okay, I can't put an animal in front of the face of a Gentile, leave them alone in a space. That I can't do, my animal. But I can sell them an animal, depending on this minhag hamakom. So my time, what's the difference here? What's the issue? I can sell an animal to a Gentile and not worry that I'm putting them in a situation where they might engage in bestiality, because they're not going to do bestiality with their own animal. Why is that? Because it causes the animal not to be able to, it's bad for the animal. It causes the animal to potentially not reproduce. So they won't want to do that to their own animal. But if I take my animal and I put it in a pundak in an inn alone with the Gentile could care less about my animal and what the ramifications of their actions are on the animal. So therefore, there's a concern there all the time. And minhag hamakom, the issue of selling it depends on whether they engage in bestiality with their animals or don't. If it's a place where people do, then I can't sell it to them. That would be putting a stumbling block. If it's a place where people don't do that because they're worried about their animals, the future reproductive abilities of their animals, that's a different story. Now, we're going to see the first case today, and there'll be another one later, where somebody hears someone's argument and changes their mind. Okay, good lesson for all of us. Af Rav Hadrabe. So then Rav changed his mind, heard what Rabbi Elazar said, seemingly, and decided to change his mind and go and say what Rabbi Elazar said, which is the pundak, the inn, has nothing to do with minhag hamakom. Is not dependent on that, because there the Gentile doesn't care about my animal. And how do we know that Rav changed his mind? Because somewhere else Rav says, in other words, Rav was quoted as having said, if the Gentiles are concerned about their own animals, that they won't become, they won't be akarot, that they won't be able to give birth, reproduce, and therefore, apparently, they'll become sterile. Therefore, the Ovei Kochavim, we can sell an animal to an Ovei Kochavim in particular circumstances. Now we're moving on to the second part of the Mishnah, which is going to be our topic for today, which is the Behemot Gasot. So we can't sell Gentiles Behemot Gasot. I already explained it when we got to the Mishnah why this is, but today we're going to kind of get to that answer. Okay? And it's not going to be so simple to get there. My timeout. What's the reason why you can't sell large animals to Gentiles? Now, we're not worried about revia with these large animals. However, we are worried they're going to do malacha on Shabbat with the animal. To which the Gemara says, V'ne'avid, okay, I sell my animal to a Gentile, and my animal works on Shabbat. It's not my animal anymore. What's the big deal? Kevan dezabne kanye. Since I sold the animal to the Gentiles, so it's the Gentile's animal. So who cares if it's my animal? It's not my animal anymore. If it's my animal is commanded not to do work on Shabbat. But once I sell it, it's not my animal. So why on earth would I not be able to sell the animal to a Gentile for that reason? To which they answer, which is what I explained when we got to the Mishnah, Gzera mishum she'ela mishum schirut. We're worried that if we allow me to sell it, I may come also to lend it or to rent it. Now, there's two ways to understand this. One is, if you allow me to sell it today, maybe tomorrow I'll rent them or loan them. Okay, what's the problem with renting and loaning? We'll talk about, the idea being that if I loan it, it's still my animal. And then my animal is doing work on Shabbat because it's in a Gentile's possession, who's not going to say, oh, I'm not going to let the animal work on Shabbat. Right? It's a Jewish animal. They're not going to say that. So that's the concern. So one concern is that if we allow me to sell today, maybe tomorrow or next week, I'll rent or loan. Another way to look at it, and for the Gemara later, it seems like perhaps this is really more the likelihood, which is if I go to sell my animal and I can't sell it, what would I do? Well, maybe I'll rent it in the meantime, right? People put their house on the market and it doesn't sell. At a certain point, right, maybe they'll decide to rent it because it's just sitting there, right? Either they'll let someone live in it, they'll loan it out because it's just an empty house, or they'll rent it and make some money at least in the meanwhile until they sell it. So it could be it's connected with that same transaction. If we allow a sale, the sale might turn into a rental or a borrowing because I obviously have this extra animal that I don't need and maybe I'll do something else with it. So in any case, whether we look at it that way or that way, there's still a concern. Maybe I'll rent or maybe I'll loan, and therefore it's forbidden. But it's not so simple. Because the Gemara now says, She'ela kanya va'agra kanya. What do you mean? If I loan my animal to you, you acquire it. And if I rent you my animal, you acquire it. Now, obviously you don't completely acquire it, but you acquire a level of responsibility. And with that, it's as if you acquire it. And this is, right, Rashi points out, it's very famous with the shoel. A shoel, because they're liable for onsim, for any kind of damage, it's like they own it temporarily. Okay, so because it's, right, think about when you rent a house, it's somewhat in your ownership, right? You feel like you could do what you want in the house. I mean, you have to do it with respect to the owner and not destroy things in the house. But, you put up pegs, hooks in the wall, and you do all sorts of things. The house becomes yours. So we're basically going to say you own it. Now, later we're going to reject this, okay? You don't really own it. But they think right now that you own it. So, Ela Amarami Bered Rav Yiva, Gzera Mishum Nisyoni. So because of this issue, they say, okay, forget it. That can't be the issue. Because if the Gentile really owns it, if they rent or borrow, then obviously we don't make a Gzera about selling. If renting or borrowing wouldn't even be an issue because it's their own and they could do with it what they want, and I'm not liable for Shvita BMT. So he says it's because of a test drive, I'll call it, because that's what we do nowadays. We take cars on test drives. Okay, so if I go to sell you my animal, before you buy the animal, you're going to make sure to take the animal on a test drive. Now, it's not a test drive because it's not that you're riding on the donkey, let's say, but the donkey is used usually for carrying a load. Now, now sometimes you might end up going to sell the animal just before Shabbat starts. Va'amrle, and the Gentile will say to you, Tanya siniale, right? You can imagine the situation. I'm sitting there 5 minutes before Shabbat, gotta light candles, and the guy says, well, I'll buy it from you, but let's first take it for a test drive. And you're thinking, oh my God, how am I going to make Shabbat? But, okay, so you take it for the test drive. Now, what are you going to do? You want it, now, they put a load on the donkey, and they tell the donkey to go. Now, you're standing there, so what do? You tell the donkey, move, right? Because that's what you do when the animal walks. You want to show the new potential owner, now remember, the animal's still yours. You want to show the new potential owner that the animal rides very nicely. So you're going to call the animal with words and say something. The animal's going to hear your voice, recognize it, right? They listen to you. And then the animal's going to carry the load because of you. Now at this point, Shabbat has come in, and the animal's going on your command. Now, first of all, it's good for you to do this. And then you're going to be over on the Isser of Mechamer Achar Behem Toh, which is you and the animal together are carrying the load, because it says Atau Behem Techa, right? You can't do work, and you and the animal doing work together is a problem. So you getting the animal to move because of your command is forbidden. If you do that, you're going to be chayav a chatat. Okay, if you do it b'shgaga, okay, maybe you didn't think Shabbat was coming in. Not sure exactly what the shgaga here is, but I think if you did it intentionally, obviously you'd be stoned. The point is, this is usher to do, and that's the concern. Okay, this is already a much more out there concern, not exactly a more typical concern. In any case, that's where we are right now. It's not where we're going to end the sugya. So let's go back to this issue of why we rejected option number one. We rejected option number one because we said we're not worried about, maybe you'll rent, maybe you'll lend, because the Gentile acquires it while they're in the period of the loan or the rental. Matkefla Rav Shisha B'Reid Ravidi. We're going to have two difficulties on this. The first one, Rav Shisha. He says, Schirut Mikanya, who says that you acquire it when you rent it? V'hatznan, doesn't it say in the Mishnah? Okay, notice both these questions are about schirut, about the rental, not about the borrowing. But it doesn't matter once you kind of say that. Now, he's going to say v'hatznan. It says in the Mishnah, we're going to learn from this Mishnah that schirut, you don't acquire it when you rent. This is about, there's certain places where you're not allowed to rent houses to Gentiles. Okay, and this is because you can't sell houses to Gentiles, so you also can't rent them. We're going to get to this whole sugya, we'll understand it better. The main issue being Israel, land in Israel, we should be selling to Gentiles. From there, we're going to get to different places and what's permitted, what's forbidden, and renting and all that. We'll get to all this later. But af b'makom shamru la'askir, which depended on whose opinion where they allowed people to rent land, lo lebeiti ra'amru. Now, when you lend out, rent out a house, let's say, to a Gentile, and they said that's okay, they say, wait, but not lebeiti ra. All the places where you're allowed to rent a house to a Gentile, again, depending on whose opinion, and we'll get to all that later, not for a house. You can't rent them a house where they live. You could rent them like a storage area, a warehouse, something like that, but not a place where they're going to live. Why? You can't rent them a place because they're going to put idols in it, in their houses. Okay, they don't put idols in their storage areas, but they put idols in their houses. And now, what do you see here? If schirut turned it into theirs, well, when the Gentile puts the idol in their house, why should it matter to me? It's not my house. They're renting it. They're the owners. So what do you see here? When you rent it, you become the owner. Because you don't become the owner, against what we said before. They're not the owners. If they were the owners, they'd be allowed to put their idols there, in which case I could rent them houses. So they answer, no. Now, nobody thinks that when you rent, you become the full owner, right? Nobody's going to say that. Obviously, that's not, you need to buy it to do that. What they were trying to say is you're, 80% the owner or something like that. So the answer to this question is, you could still say that they own it. Okay, let's say 80% they're owners. And that's enough to say, with the animal, let's say they can work the animal. Okay, and that's why we had to come up with this Nisyoni answer. But, Shane Avodah Zarah, you could still say you can't rent them a house. Why? Because if they're going to put their idols in it, Avodah Zarah is Chamire. That's much more severe than even Shabbat, right? Shvitat Be'emah b'Shabbat is not as severe as Avodah Zarah. And having Avodah Zarah in your house, it says, Lo tavito eval beitecha. It says, don't bring any despicable item, which is an idol in the pasuk there, to your house. Now, if this is even 20% your house, or 10% your house, or whatever percentage we give it, it's still somewhat your house. So we're not going to allow Avodah Zarah, but again, that might not be true for Shvitat Be'emah. So we're back to, schirut, Sheila, it's not really an issue because they really do own it. This issue with the house is just a unique issue with Avodah Zarah. However, the second question is going to really knock out the fact that you're not the owner when you rent something, okay? And that's clear from this next source. So now we got a different person who brings a difficulty. Was schirut mikanya? when you rent something, do you really become the owner? V'hatzanan, it says in the Mishnah, Yisrael shesachar parami kohen, a Jew a regular Yisrael who rents a cow from a kohen. Now, animals of kohanim are allowed to eat truma food. So, yachilena karshine truma. Karshinim are a type of animal fodder. You can give them animal fodder that's truma because even though you're a Yisrael, okay, you rented this animal from a kohen, you're allowed to basically feed this food to the animal because the animal is still in the ownership of the kohen. And likewise, kohen shesachar parami Yisrael, even though now a kohen who rents an animal, even though the responsibility of feeding that animal is now on the kohen, in other words, they're enough of an owner, they have to feed the animal. However, lo yachilenu karshine truma. You can't feed this karshinim, which is vetch. You can't feed vetch that's truma, even though you're a kohen, because it's not your animal. That's what's obvious from here. Isa kadat taschir kanya. If you're going to say renting it makes it your own, amai lo yachilena paradidehu. Right? Why can't the kohen feed it truma food? It's basically the kohen's. And therefore, now the Gemara concludes. So we just basically proven from this, it's a Mishnah in Trumot, we've proven that it's clear that whoever rents whoever rents does not become the owner, which means that if we go back to the Jew selling to the Gentile, we are concerned maybe he'll rent it. And if he rents it, it's still the Jews. If he rents it out to a Gentile, it's still the Jews, and the Jews' animal will be doing work on Shabbat. And therefore, the Gemara says, if you're going to say the renter does not become the owner, Gzera mishum schirut, the reason why this Mishnah forbids is for 3 reasons now. Maybe you'll come to rent it, Ugzera mishum she'ela, maybe you'll come to lend it, and Gzera mishum nisione, or maybe you'll end up Erev Shabbat trying to sell it, and you'll end up having the animal move on Shabbat on your account, and that will be forbidden. So 3 possible reasons. Now we added another one, the earlier one that when we thought to reject the first answer, we came up with a different one. We end up concluding all 3. Now we're going to start to see heterim, all sorts of, if it looked like it was black and white, can't sell large animals, not so black and white. So Rav Ada, the first thing we have is Rav Ada Shara Lizabune Chamra Aide Safsira. Rav Ada permitted to sell a donkey or any kind of animal using a middle person. Okay, so I can sell it to a Jew who, not sell it, but hire someone to do the sale for me. And then it's permitted. Why does this resolve all the issues? Well, let's go through. Imishum nisione, if we're worried about that weird circumstance where you're going to be mechamer the animal, you're going to be, involved in that. Well, if someone else is doing the sale for you, halo yada lakale da azla machamate. They won't recognize that person's voice if they go for a test drive. So the animal is not going to recognize the voice of this middle person. No one's going to listen to him or her, so it's not going to happen. And it's only when it's the actual owner doing it, so you don't have that issue. Now, if I basically hire someone to sell my animal, I hire them to sell my animal. I didn't hire them to rent it. I didn't hire them to lend it out. They have no ability to do that. I didn't give them the rights to do that. I gave them power of attorney basically to sell, not to do anything else, so they won't come to do that. Now this, by the way, this and the next line seem to fit in with the interpretation that we're worried that at that moment of selling, they might, if they can't sell it, they might just rent it or loan it out. And not that, if we allow it now, they might come to do it some other time, right? Because you could say, if they, as a middle person, if they do it, then maybe a different time they'll actually think they can rent. But this seems to be at the moment. They won't be able to rent or loan because I didn't tell them they could do that. Ve'od mishum de lo nigle be'muma. Now they were hired to basically sell, so they want to sell, right? Like think about a real estate agent, right? They want to do anything they can to sell that house. Now, if they rent it or loan it, someone's going to use that animal, just like a house. Take a house, right? Some people like to rent a house first before they buy, right? Went with an option to buy so that they get to see the house and what the kinks are and decide whether this really fits or not. Same idea here. And the problem is all animals have downsides, just like all houses have downsides and all, right? There's always a downside. And it's not in your best interest to loan it or rent it because people will see all the downsides and then people will start talking about this animal, on Sunday mornings they don't work so well or they, this kind of thing. So you don't want that to happen. And therefore, this middle person who was hired, the agent, is not going to want to loan it or rent it because it's bad for them to actually sell. Now, this, by the way, would be an issue also for the owner. So you have to wonder, but I guess it's the fact that we have all three reasons that already is enough to permit the agent to do it. Okay, next case. And now we're going to have a few interesting cases where very prominent rabbis did things that didn't exactly look like they should be doing them. So Rav Huna Zabin Ahi Paralove Kochavim. Rav Huna sold a cow of his to a Gentile. Okay, this seems completely against what it says. So how do we explain this? And Amarle Rav Chisda, my tamav barhachi. He said, Chisda says to Rav Huna, what are you doing? How'd you do that? Amarle, Imar the Shchita Zavna. Oh, well, I figured it was likely the Gentile was buying it to slaughter. And that's why I sold it to the Gentile. Wow, this is a big deal, right? That already means that we can, if we can assume they're doing it for slaughtering, we can allow this. So the Gemara now turning to Amud Bet, tries to explain where we have a source for this. And then Rav is going to reject the source, okay? But let's see. Now, how do we know that we could say this? Now, Rashi says something interesting, which raises some questions. But Rashi says, how do we know now, even though this isn't really a Lifnei Iver issue, okay, but they somehow seem to mix in Lifnei Iver here and kind of don't really talk about the Shvita Behema issue. Okay, Rabba is going to bring up the Shvita Behema issue and say, no, you can't say that. There's Shvita Behema going on here. But we'll get back to that. But it seems to be, for some reason, the Gemara is going in the direction of the Lifnei Iver. That if I put a stumbling block before someone, right? What's the case, the literal case? I put a stumbling block before a blind person. By the way, Alana Steinhain Shiur hopefully will go up today or tomorrow. It's going to be on Lifnei Iver, okay? Which is a fascinating topic in and of itself. Also, Meirav Tubakan already heard one up, I think it was last week already, about Lifnei Iver, or maybe the beginning of this week. Okay, so now the question is, if I put a stumbling block before a blind person, they're definitely going to trip over it, right? But if it's not clear, right, it's not so clear, okay, which we're going to talk about right now, that it's a Lifnei Iver issue, maybe they'll stumble on it, maybe they won't. Well, then already we can be more lenient, okay? Maybe Lifnei Iver doesn't even apply there, and that's what they're going to say right now. Ditnan. Beit Shammai omrim, lo yimkor adam para hachoreshet b'shvi'it. You can't sell someone a cow which plows. You can't sell them a plowing cow, okay, a cow that could be used for plowing, on the Shemitah year. Now here we have the Lifnei Iver issue, which is, if it's the Shemitah year, and I sell an animal to a Jew who maybe will work with that animal on the Shemitah year. It's not clear they're going to work with the animal on the Shemitah year because people buy animals, right? We've seen this actually, sugyas about this before, that people buy animals like this, right, cows, for slaughtering, and people buy them for working, for plowing. So Beit Shammai is strict, but Beit Hillel says you don't have to worry they're going to plow on Shabbat because the person on the Shemitah year, they're not going to use the animal for plowing on the Shemitah year, which would be forbidden because you can't plow your field. But it's not a Lifnei Iver issue. The fact that I'm giving them a cow, does that mean they're going to now go and plow? It's so tempting, they're going to do that. But Hillel says no, they might buy the cow and they'll want to slaughter it. So you're allowed to do that. That's a Lifnei Iver. And right, because you're putting the stumbling block, but it's because it could go either way, there's no Lifnei Iver issue. But I'm a rabbi. Rabbi says, okay, but that doesn't help us in our situation. Maybe Lifnei Iver, you could say, well, it depends, since it could be for slaughtering. It's not definitive. It's not like putting the stumbling block that they'll definitely trip over, right? It's like something that maybe they'll trip, but maybe they won't. But midame hatam ein adam mitzugal shvita behem to b'shvi'it. This doesn't have the added element of Shvita Behema because there's no, okay, on Shabbat, my animal's not allowed to work. No one ever said that on Shemitah there's a prohibition for my animal to work in the Shemitah year. No, there's a prohibition for me to plow my field, but there's no prohibition for my animal to work. But hacha adam mitzuvel shvitat behem to b'Shabbat. But in the case of the animal and me selling the animal, maybe I'll rent it, maybe I'll lend it, and then my animal will work on Shabbat. That is a problem of shvita behema. I can't say, oh, well, maybe they'll slaughter it. It works for lifnei iver. I could be what we call tzliya lekula. I can be lenient in that case, but not when there's an isser of shvita behema. So now we're going to question Rava from two perspectives. Okay? By the way, it's a question whether it's Rabba or Rava here. But either which way, we're going to question it from two directions. Because Rava says two things, really. He says, Ein adam mitzuval shvitat behem to b'shvi. You're not commanded on shvitat behema, and since you're not commanded, it's permitted. And when you are commanded al shvitat behem to on Shabbat, for example, it's forbidden. Okay? And you can't say, oh, maybe yes, maybe no. And that according to Rava, it all depends on, is there some isur on your animal to work on Shabbat or not, or, to work on Shvi'it or not? So, and, are we commanded about this issue? So we're going to knock it out from two perspectives, and then Rav Ashi is going to give a different explanation as to why this isn't a good proof and why there's a difference between the Shemitah and our case. So, now we say, or whatever, we'll get to Rav Ashi soon, we'll explain. So first he's pointing out the last line of Rabbah. Anytime someone's commanded, like for shvitat behema, let's say, it's forbidden, and you can't say, oh, maybe he bought it for shchita purposes. V'harei sadeh. We'll give you an example of a field. Now, adam mitzuva al shvitat sadeh u'b'shvi'it. Obviously, your field is not allowed to be worked on the Shemitah year. Okay, just like your animal can't work on Shabbat, your field can't work in the Shemitah year. Which would mean that if I sell you a field on the Shemitah year, it should be forbidden because of the whole issue of shvitat sadeh. Now, what are we going to learn here? Utnan Beit Shammai omrim lo yimkor adam steinir b'Shabbat b'Shvi'it. You can't sell a plowed field on the Shemitah year because someone will come and plant it. Ubeit Hillel mitirim. Beit Hillel say it's totally fine. Mipnei she'achol lahovira. Because there's two possibilities. When I sell you a field in the Shemitah year, you can either decide to plant it, or you can say, I'll leave it for next year because it's Shemitah year now. Okay? Same two options as, right? Maybe the animals for slaughtering purposes, maybe the animals for work. So basically he says this clearly doesn't fit with what Rabbah said. Okay, Rabbah tried to reject that proof, and this doesn't work. Because here, if you are obligated on Shvitat Sadeh, then Rabbah would say, then it's going to be forbidden. And look, Beit Hillel permits. And Matkifla Rav Ashi rejects it also, the first part of his statement, called if a person's not commanded on shvitat animals, he said, right? Your animal is not forbidden to work in the Shemitah year. It's just that you can't work the land, but your animal's not forbidden. And then it's going to be permitted, because you could say, oh, well, I just sold it for slaughter, right? I sold it to the Jew for slaughtering purposes. V'harei kelim, de'en adam mitzuvel shvitat kelim b'shvi'it. Now, my implements that I use in my field, okay, I need the plow, and we're going to see a whole bunch of others. There's no prohibition for those vessels, those kelim, to work on Shemitah year. But it's none. Elohim kelim she'ein adam rashai l'mochram b'shvi'it. Hamachresha v'kol keleha ha'ol v'amizrev ha'deker. Okay, the plow and everything that goes with the plow, the yoke, the winnowing fork, and the stake. Those are all things you use in the field, and you can't sell them to people in the Shemitah year, even though there's no prohibition for Shvitat Kelim. So these two statements that Rabbah made, neither of them work, okay? Because in both these cases, we're going to either permit or forbid in opposite directions. It doesn't work with what he said. And therefore, we reject what Rabbah said, and comes Rav Ashi with his explanation. Why did Rav Huna sell this animal and say, oh, well, I did it for slaughtering purpose. Right, I assume he could have slaughtered it. Ella Amar Rav Ashi. Right, now, I just want to remind you, what we did so far, because it's a little bit of a confusing structure. Rav Huna sold the para. Rav Chisda came and said, why'd you do this? Rav Huna explained, I did it because I assumed that he was, that at least, this is what we call, you can be tolet. I can assume, I don't know, but I can assume that he bought it for slaughtering and then it's not a problem. Okay? Then we said, how do we know that this is okay? Like, you can not worry about lifnei iver in this kind of case because of the case of the Shemitah, okay, where you see. And then Rabbah rejects this proof, and then we have difficulties with Rabbah. And now comes Rav Ashi and brings his own explanation. And comes Rav Ashi and says, just lost my place. Okay, Amar Rav Ashi, Kol hecha di'ika lemitla talinan va'af agav de mitzuveh. Kol hecha de'leika lemitne lo talinan af agav de eno mitzuveh. Comes Rav Ashi and he says, forget Rabbah's distinction. I don't agree whether you're commanded in Shvita Kelim, you're not commanded in Shvita Kelim, Shvita Behema, all this. That's not the issue. And he neutralizes that issue completely, as we saw from all the difficulties we raised. That's not the issue. What's the issue? It's simply a percentage game. Okay? Now, he doesn't say what the percentages have to be. Does it have to be 50-50? Okay? But it's somehow a percentage game. Could it be 30-70? I don't know. He doesn't say specifically. But he says, if there's a good chance, okay, we don't know what a good chance means, but if there's a chance, some sort of good chance, decent chance, that the person's buying it for slaughtering, then it's already permitted. Okay? That's what he basically says. And if there's a chance, if it's likely he's not buying it for that purpose, and the Gentile is likely buying the animal to work the field, then you definitely can't, because then you have the issue of Shvitat Be'emto. Okay? So it all depends on what the more likely scenario is. I want to go back and just give a logical reason for, let's say, Shvi'it. Okay? If I sell a field, it's likely they're not going to work it this year because people buy things for the long term. But implements, right? You're not going to buy this year, right? You wouldn't go to the gardening store in the Shemitah year and start buying all sorts of gardening tools when you're not using them. But you might buy a field and say, okay, next year I'll work the field. So you could see why there's this distinction about it's more likely that when you're buying tools, you're buying them to use right away. Whereas opposed to you're buying land, it's a more long term. So you have to employ logic in what's more likely. Now we're going to get to another situation. Rabba Zabin Ahu Chamra L'Yisrael Achashud Limkor Lo Ve'Kochavim. So we talked about selling to Gentiles. You can't do that. We talked about that you could do it with a middle person. Okay, that's allowed because, right, so the first thing we did today was talk about why you can't sell the animals. And then we figured out it's these three reasons. Shema this, Shema that. You're worried you're going to rent, you're worried you're going to lend, all that. Then we have Rav Adu who comes and said, well, with a middle person you can because you don't have to worry about any of those issues. We have Rav Huna who actually went against this and did it, but explained it because he understood that it was likely that the Gentile was buying it for slaughtering purposes. It took us a while to figure out why, right? And in the end we said, well, Rav Ashi says it's really just because we can, if there's reason to believe that we can assume, and we don't have to assume the worst. And now we have a case where Rabbah went and sold, this is a new case, sold to a Jew who's chashud limkor lo ve'kochavim, who has a track record that they sell to Gentiles. So now we said, okay, well, I can do that because I'm selling to a Jew. What's the problem? The fact that they're going to sell to somebody else, that's not my problem. Amalei Abai, my time Avim Marhachi. Abai said, Rabbah, why did you do that? Remember the relationship. Rabbah was his adopted father. He said, and he always questions him, why'd you do that? Amalei, Ana the Yisrael Zabine, I sold it to a Jew. What's the problem? Hamarle, Abai says, but in the end it's going to get into the hands of Ovei Kochavim. And you're going to, right, it's likely because they have a track record, and then you're ending up creating this problem. So now it's like a question of whether this is the continuation of Abai's words, okay, or it's really, I have a little note there that says, add the words Amarle. And this Rabbah's response is, Lovei Kochavim kabazabin l'Yisrael lo kabazabin. I know this person is sold many times to Gentiles, but what? They won't sell to a Jew? They'll sell to anyone who buys from them. So maybe they'll sell to a Jew, just like we had before with Rav Huna. Maybe he's buying it for slaughtering purposes, right? And then it's not a problem. Maybe he's not going to sell to a Gentile. Like, I don't have to assume just because I sold him this animal, he's going to sell to a Gentile. So that's Rabbah. However, Abai comes and questions him. And from here we're going to get into a very relevant and interesting and controversial sugya. We're going to have like 3 braitas till we get there, but we're going to have this is a long, till we get to that question exactly. Eitive. Makom shenagulim korbe madaka lekutim muchlim. Remember the kutim they're sort of pseudo-Jews. They converted. Some people say they were real converts. Some people say they just converted out of fear because of the lions, without getting into the whole story of how they converted and all that. But they're people who are suspect. They don't keep all the halachot. So now it says, if you live in a place where people sell small animals to kutim, you can sell. If they don't sell to kutim there, then you can't sell. So my time, so the Gemara says, what's the reason? What is this dependent on? If you think it's because we're concerned they're going to engage in bestiality, we know from another source that kutim they're suspect of a bunch of things, but not that. How do we know? Because it says in a braita. Okay, second braita. We're going to quote 3 braitot now. Vahatanya. This is what we saw before in the Mishnah, but now it's in a braita with a more elaborate version. You can't put animals in this inn with the Gentiles. Scharim etzel scharim, even male, like a male Gentile with a male animal. Nikevot etzel nikevot, female with female. Ein tzarich lomar, and of course, all the more so, nikevot etzel scharim, scharim etzel nikevot, females with male animals, male humans with female animals. You can't give your animal to their shepherds because, again, they're suspect. Now, another issue. You don't go into a room alone with a Gentile because those Gentiles were considered to be murderers, and it's very dangerous to have a Jew and Gentile alone in a room. The Gentile could kill the Jew. Don't have them teach your children. Dangerous. But wait. Kutim, it's not a problem. And this is why we brought this source to show it. The first source is not because, right, the Makam Shanagu, Limkor, and not Limkor, has nothing to do with concern for Reviyah, because look at the source. This says all the things you can't do with a Gentile, but you can be Mami Be'ema B'puntakot Shel Kutim. And here we start with the other case. Scharim Eitzel Nekevot, even males with females. Or Nekevot Eitzel Scharim, where there's more of a concern. And Ein Tzarich Lomar Scharim Eitzel Scharim Nekevot Eitzel Nekevot. And obviously you can have Scharim with Scharim, Nekevot and Nekevot where there's less of concern. And Mosrim Be'ema L'Reshalim, you can give your animals to their shepherds. And Mityachadim Imahem, you could be alone in a room with them, you're not worried. By the way, it says Miyachadim, but most change it to Mityachadim. You can go into a room alone with them, and don't worry about that they're going to kill you, because they're not murderers. You can give your child to learn how to read with them, and to teach them a trade. Obviously, they're not suspect. Third braita, ve'od Tanya. And furthermore, it says, Ein mochrim lahem, lo zayim ve'lo klei zayin. Here comes the big sugya. You can't sell them weapons. You can't sell them implements that go along with the weapons. Ve'ein mashchizim lahem tazayin. You can't sharpen their knives, their weapons, their swords. Ve'ein mochrim lahem lo sadam ve'lo kolerim ve'lo kvalim ve'lo shashot shabarzel. These are all sorts of chains and irons they put around their neck, around their legs, around their, any kind of iron chains. Echad ovei kochavim ve'echad kuti. You can't sell weapons not to an ovei kochavim and not to a kuti. My time. So what's the reason? Now, if you're worried because they're going to murder you with them, right? This is the whole sugya about can you sell weapons, right? Big issue in Israel. Government of Israel sells lots of weapons to countries that do with it, that are shofchei damim, are murderers and use it, and it's a big, big question, controversial issue, okay? And here it is, the source is black and white here. This is not permitted. Okay, now if you're worried that you can't, with the question is, why can't you sell it to the kutim? If you're worried that they're murderers, well, michashide, we already said before, and this is why we quoted all these braitot, ha'amarta u'mityachadim imahem. You can be alone. We're not worried they're going to murder you. They're not murderers. So what's the reason? And this is why we got to this, if you remember why we got here. Ela mishum da'ate l'zebuni lo'ovei kochavim. The obvious problem with the kuti is don't sell weapons. So here this goes even farther. Not only don't sell weapons to countries that are using it for mass murder or whatever it might be, but don't sell weapons to people who might sell them weapons. Okay? That's why you can't sell to the kuti. Because they themselves are not bad people, but they might sell. Which means, going back to our case, so again, Abaye says to Rabbah, why did you sell to this Jew if the Jew could sell to the Gentile, right? Remember, the Jew is already had a track record that they sell to Gentiles. So why are you allowed to sell this animal, knowing that the Jew might sell to the Gentile, just like we can't sell weapons to the kutim because there's a concern they'll sell to the Gentile. Now, Abaye himself says, well, if you want to answer me, I already have an answer for this. If you want to answer me, Kuti lo avitshuva, Yisrael avitshuva, just because this person was generally selling to Gentiles, maybe he'll repent. Whereas with the Kutim, we don't anticipate they're going to repent at all. Okay, and therefore, if they sell to Gentiles in general, they'll continue selling, and therefore you shouldn't do it. But Ha'amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, Kederach Shamru Asur Limkor Lovei Kochavim, Kach Asur Limkor L'Yisrael, Chashuv Limkor Lovei Kochavim. Maybe you should have quoted this in the first place. But he says, Rabbi Bar Ravua basically said, if you can't sell to the Gentile, you can't sell it to a Jew who's suspect to sell to Gentiles. We don't think, maybe the Jew will repent. So, what happened? Well, Rabbi heard what Abaye said and changed his mind. I told you, we started at the beginning of the daf, we have at the end of the daf. He changed his mind. The problem was it was a little too late. Right, but he ran after the guy, Tlata Parsa, 3 parsa oat, Yikad Amrit Parsa B'chala. Some people say he ran 3 parsa oat in the, 1 parsa, but in the sand, which wasn't so easy to run. Vilo Adrache, but he didn't catch up to the person. In other words, in the end, he sold to this Jew who likely was going to sell to the Gentile, and he shouldn't have done that. Okay. Amar of Dimi Bar Abba. This, by the way, is the daf has a lot of interesting things. One of them is this whole fascinating sugi about selling weapons to people who might use it for destructive purposes. But in general, we also have a lot of back and forth. People do things, right? Rabbis do things, and then other rabbis say, what are you doing? And how could you do that? And, what happened to setting an example for other people? And number one, but also it seems to be halachically problematic what you're doing. And either they change their mind about it, or they have an answer and a reason to why they did it. Okay. Amar of Dimi Bar Abba, Kederach Shasor L'Nkor Lovei Kochavim, Kach Asor L'Nkor L'Listim Yisrael. Okay, now, we talked about before about the weapons. Just like you can't sell weapons to Gentiles, you also can't sell them to bandits, Jewish bandits. Okay? It's not just, right, it's bad people in general. It doesn't mean just Gentiles. It means bad people who might do bad things with it. So, Hechidami, what's the problem? What's the case? If the guy's a murdering bandit, well, pshita, obviously you can't sell to them. You don't even need to tell me that. It's quite clear. Hainu ovei kochavim, that's exactly like an ovei kochavim, if he's a murderer, right? Remember, the ovei kochavim that they're talking about were murderers in general. Again, you have to understand it that way, not just any Gentile is clearly a murderer. V'i de lo katil, and if they're not going to murder, amai lo, well then why not? Why can't you sell it to them? Lo olam de lo katil. So they say really is it's when they aren't known to be murderers. Bahacha b'mayaskinam b'mashmota. Dezimnin de avid latzule nafshe. We're talking about a bandit who, could get into a situation with someone where the person might stand up to them, try to kill them, and then they'll try to defend themselves. And if you give them weapons, they'll actually murder. So it's in a sense, it's someone who gets himself into situations where they're actually going to use your weapons in self-defense, but will kill somebody. So it's not because they're murderers, but it's because they might do actions that might lead them to a murderous situation. Or maybe not murder, but injure someone seriously. Amar of Dimi Bar Abba. We just read that. Tanu Rabbanan. We're going to end with this last part. Mochrim lehem trisim, v'yesh omrim mochrim lehem trisim. This is also very interesting. You can't sell them shields, things to protect themselves, even though it's, right, defensive and not offensive. And some people say you can. Good question, right? Can you sell Gentiles defensive weapons? My time. So what's the reason? If you're going to say you can't sell them because they protect them in war and it's just part of their war stuff. Well, great question. Well, they need food, so maybe you can't sell them food to survive so that they can fight their wars. Maybe that's a problem. To which, I'm a Rav, and I know some people have talked about this before after class, Rav says, Efshar hachinami. Says, that's because it's impossible. If we don't sell them wheat and barley, Rashi says, Efshar below eva. They're going to hate us. In other words, you have to balance all these issues, and that's really what the Sugya is all about. It's about finding balance here. Okay? On the one hand, right, we don't want you to sell them weapons. We don't want you to sell them anything that's going to help them be fighting their wars, like even food. But if we go so far, we're going to be in major trouble with them if they see that we won't even sell them food. So we have to sell them some things, but draw the line somewhere. Okay? And that's a big balancing game and fascinating sugya. So what did we do today? We started with finished up the Be'ema Daka and the comparison of that to the other Mishnah where it didn't say Menach HaMakom. This one did say. Then we came up with a distinction. The Rav actually changes his mind. We went to the Be'ema Gasa. It took us a while to figure out what exactly we ended up coming full circle back to the first reason we had, and then keeping the second reason as well, and saying it's actually all these reasons. Shema Yaskir Shema, you'll loan, and also the test drive. And then we had all these situations. Rav Ada first permits it by using a middle person. We had Rav Huna, who actually did sell a cow to a Gentile and justified it, saying, it was probably for shechita purposes, and that we had to kind of figure out why, in that case, it's okay. And Rav Ashi, who really ends up answering, it really depends on what the likelihood is, without giving us exact numbers of what the percentages are. From there, we got to Rabbah, who Abaye gets very upset with, that Rabbah sold to a Jew who was suspect of selling to Gentiles, and basically Abaye convinces Rabbah that he's right and that he shouldn't have sold it, but it was kind of too late, even though Rabbah tried to undo it, but he couldn't. From there, we got to selling weapons, and from there, we got to selling weapons to Jewish bandits. It's also an issue, and ended with the issue of, can you sell defensive weapons to people to Gentiles, and is that a problem? And with that, we finish for today. Really fascinating topics. Wishing everyone a good day, and hoping for peace soon in all the light of all these weapon discussions and complicated Gentile relations.